That night, I woke up thirsty. The wall clock showed it was nearly midnight. The whole house was asleep. As I passed through the kitchen, I suddenly heard my daughter-in-law's voice, very soft but unmistakably clear. "I've already found a place. They're used to taking care of elderly people there." I stopped, my hand still gripping the glass of water. There was no arguing, no debate, just a neat, concise sentence, as if everything had already been decided long ago. My son said nothing. His silence weighed heavily than any words could have. My heart started pounding, not out of fear, but from that familiar feeling older people know when they realize they are about to become unnecessary. At that moment, I understood that if I didn't leave on my own, I would be taken away. I am a 73-year-old woman, widowed for many years. After my husband passed away, I moved in with my son's family. I don't drive, I'm not good with smartphones, and I live a slow life, speaking little. I know I'm no longer young, but I also know I'm not weak. I've always believed that people are not born to hurt one another. Sometimes they simply forget that truth. If you are listening to this story and still believe that families can heal, that kindness must walk hand in hand with awareness, then you're welcome to stay with us. Please subscribe to the channel to continue listening to stories for those who value gentleness and inner peace. When I first moved in with my son, things weren't as bad as they later became. At the time, my son said it wasn't good for me to live alone, especially after his father passed away. He told me to move in so there would be people coming and going, shared meals, and voices in the house. I thought so too. At that age, I didn't hope for much, just the presence of human warmth under the same roof. Initially, my daughter-in-law would still ask me what I liked to eat, as well as whether I needed extra blankets or pillows. I helped look after my grandchild, cooked simple meals, folded clothes, and wiped down the kitchen table. I never saw it as an obligation. I only thought that as long as I could still do something, I should, so I could feel that I was still valuable. Then things began to change, very slowly. So slowly that if you weren't paying attention, you might think it was normal. Shared family meals became less frequent. I ate earlier or later, depending on their schedules. The room I stayed in was changed to a smaller one near the storage area because the old room was more convenient for the children. I nodded. To me, any room was just a place to sleep. Household decisions gradually stopped, including me. When the living room was renovated, when the car was changed, when daily routines were rearranged, I only found out after everything was already done. Once I made a small suggestion about buying an extra chair for the kitchen. My daughter-in-law smiled lightly and said they would think about it later. After that, no one mentioned it again. I realized that I had started to live more closed off. I spoke less. When something didn't sit right with me, I reminded myself to stay quiet. I used to think that silence wasn't out of fear, but out of a desire not to create more conflict. I believed that in a family, if everyone could keep their inner calm, significant issues would shrink and small ones would pass. Some evenings, I would sit alone in my room, listening to the laughter and conversation coming from the living room. I wasn't deeply sad, just a little hollow. I would sit still, breathe slowly, and pay attention to my heartbeat, keeping it from chasing thoughts that would make my heart feel heavier. I told myself that everyone has times when they're tired or tense. Maybe they just needed more space. I didn't blame my son. I thought he was caught between his roles as a husband and a son. I didn't blame my daughter-in-law either. I thought perhaps I made her uneasy in some way, simply by being an older adult living in the house. I chose to adjust myself first, be less of a disturbance, appear less often, expect less. I once believed that enduring a little for the sake of household peace was the right thing to do. If you could keep your heart calm, the home would remain calm. If you didn't argue over words, relationships would always have room to return. I didn't know that while I was trying so hard to keep everything steady inside myself, outside, everything was slowly slipping beyond my control. It didn't happen in a burst of anger. It took place on a very ordinary evening after dinner. My daughter-in-law was the one who spoke first. Her voice wasn't raised or sharp. On the contrary, it was slow and precise, as if she had prepared it long in advance. "Mom, we think it would be better to arrange a more suitable place for you to live. There, people can take care of you and there's a stable daily routine. It would be better for you." I looked at her, then turned to my son. He didn't look at me. His eyes rested on the tabletop, on the glass of water, on anywhere but my face. After a moment he spoke, his voice even and emotionless. "You're getting older. Over there it would be less tiring for you. You'd have people your age to talk to. At home, we're busy too." Those words, taken separately, sounded perfectly reasonable. There was nothing rude, nothing incorrect. But placed together, in that familiar kitchen, they created a chilling feeling. I understood then that this wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. What hurt me most wasn't what my daughter-in-law said. She spoke plainly in the manner of someone used to organizing and controlling everything. What hurt me was my son's silence before that, and the very slight nod he gave in the end. No objection, no hesitation, not a single question about what I thought. I didn't resist. I didn't argue either. I sat still, my hands resting on my knees, listening as my heartbeat slowed. In that moment, I forced myself not to say anything that came from pain. I thought that perhaps they were afraid too, afraid of responsibility, afraid of the future, afraid of having to care for an older adult who was growing slower by the day. I thought that maybe my presence made them uneasy, reminding them of things they weren't ready to face. I didn't see myself as a victim. I only saw one thing clearly. In this house, I was no longer part of the decision-making, and when a person is no longer asked for their opinion, they have long since been pushed outside, even if they stay. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, I stayed behind alone. The lights in my room were off, with only dim lights spilling in from the hallway. I didn't cry, at least not yet. I sat quietly on the bed, placing both hands on my thighs, breathing slowly the way I always do when my heart feels unsettled. I let my emotions pass through me. The feeling of being let down, the feeling of being left behind, the pain, not sharp but dull and lingering. I didn't try to push them away. I simply observed them, allowing them to settle on their own. I had learned long ago not to make decisions when the mind is in turmoil. Decisions made that way often leave scars that last longer than the original pain. In that silence, I asked myself a straightforward question. If I stayed, who would I be in this house? Someone being cared for, or someone to be arranged? Someone who is listened to, or someone who must wait for others to decide on their behalf? The answer came softly. There was no loud voice in my head, just a clear feeling. I couldn't stay in a place where my presence made others uneasy. Not because I was angry with them, but because I needed to preserve my own dignity. I stood up, opened the closet, and took out my old suitcase. I wasn't in a hurry. I only packed what was truly necessary. Simple clothes, a few old photographs, a scarf. I used every morning. I didn't bring much, and I didn't leave behind any words of blame. I decided to leave, not to run away, but to avoid living with the feeling that I was a burden. There are times when leaving isn't giving up. It's the only way to protect one's self-respect. The train station late at night was colder than I expected. The white lights shining down on the tiled floor made everything look pale and distant. There weren't many people. A few empty benches were lined up, and the announcements over the loudspeaker played evenly, as if they had nothing to do with the people waiting there. I pulled my suitcase closer to my feet and sat down. Only then did I truly feel the exhaustion in my body, not from walking too much, but from a long day that had taken far more out of me than I realized. I looked at the departure board, then around me, as if to make sure I was really there, not in some half-awake dream. I didn't know when the tears began to fall. I wasn't crying out loud, just warm drops rolling steadily down my cheeks. I didn't feel despair. I only felt empty, the kind of emptiness that comes when you finally let go of something you've held onto for a very long time. As I was wiping my face, I heard a voice in front of me. A young woman stood there wearing a thin coat holding a handbag. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't press with questions. She spoke very gently. "Are you okay?" I was about to say that I was fine, the familiar answer people use to end all questions. But somehow, I nodded and shook my head at the same time. She sat down on the bench across from me, keeping just enough distance. She didn't ask anything else. She simply sat there. Her silence made me feel safe, and when I began to speak, the words came naturally. I told her that I had left my son's house in the middle of the night. I told her they thought it was best for me. I told her I wasn't angry, just sad. I didn't speak with resentment. I didn't talk to find someone to take my side. I simply told the truth, as if speaking to myself. The young woman listened without interrupting, without showing pity. When I stopped, she nodded slightly. "You did what many people don't dare to do," she said. "You chose to respect yourself." Those words didn't immediately resolve the issue, but they let me know that on that cold night at the train station, I wasn't completely alone. The young woman sat across from me for a long time. She didn't rush to ask anything else, just looked at me with deep focus, as if trying to piece together scattered fragments in her mind. Then she asked a question so slowly that it made me pause. "Were you a teacher?" I was slightly surprised. I nodded. I had taught elementary school for nearly 40 years before retiring. She leaned forward as if to make sure she hadn't heard wrong. "Did you used to teach at a small school near a working-class area?" That question triggered a distant memory. I closed my eyes for a moment. So many children had passed through my life. I couldn't remember all their names, only faces and eyes. I remembered children coming to class in shoes that were too tight and wearing thin jackets during winter. I remembered buying extra notebooks, extra coats, extra pairs of shoes, then saying they were leftovers or donations from the school so the children wouldn't feel embarrassed. "I don't remember each child clearly," I said honestly, "but if I helped at all, it must have been something small." The young woman let out a slow breath. Her eyes reddened. She took out her phone, tapped a few times, then held it out toward me. On the screen was an old, faded photograph. A small classroom. Children are sitting neatly, and behind them, a woman much younger than I am now. It was me. "The person in this photo," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "is you, and the boy standing in the front row on the left is my father." I looked again at the photo. A thin face, bright eyes. Suddenly, I remembered. A quiet boy, very diligent in his studies, always wearing worn-out shoes. I had bought him a new pair of shoes one winter. I remembered because he bowed his head for a long time when I gave them to him. "My father used to say," she continued, "that if it hadn't been for a teacher back then, his life might have gone in a very different direction. You may not know it, but what you did stayed with him for decades." I didn't know what to say. I didn't feel a surge of pride, only a profound stillness. I had done those things without expecting to be remembered. I had forgotten them myself, like so many small things I had done throughout my life. She smiled through her tears. "Please don't think of this as repayment. I didn't meet you to repay you. I just believe some acts of kindness don't disappear. They simply return at the moment someone needs them most." I sat quietly. In that cold train station, I suddenly understood that some seeds we plant long ago only begin to sprout after we've forgotten them. And perhaps that was life's way of reminding me that kindness is never wasted. After the story came to an end, the young woman sat quietly for a long time. She didn't rush to do anything next. I sensed a very real hesitation in her, as if she were weighing whether she should take one more step or not. "I could call my father," she finally said. "But you're not obligated to meet him. I just think you should have another option." The way she spoke put me at ease. It wasn't the confidence of someone who believed she could fix everything, but the respect she showed for the person in front of her. I glanced at the clock on the station wall. The next train was still quite a while away. "I'd like to think about it a bit more," I said. She nodded without any sign of disappointment. I sat there, thinking very slowly. I thought about the years that had passed. I wondered whether, if I were to meet that former student again, I would expect anything from him. I asked myself whether I was unconsciously waiting for compensation. And then I answered myself very clearly. I didn't need anyone to repay me. I only needed a safe place to stand on my own. Ultimately, I was the one who spoke first. I said that I was willing to meet her father, but with one apparent condition. I didn't want anyone to intervene on my family's behalf. I didn't want revenge. I also didn't want this story to be used to shame my son. I only wanted the right to make my own decisions about my life. The young woman listened to every word. "I understand," she said, "and if my father does anything, it will only be within the boundaries you allow." When she made the call, I couldn't hear the conversation clearly. I only saw her expression turn serious, sometimes tightening, sometimes softening. When she hung up, she turned to me. "My father will come. But he said something I won't forget," she said. "He said that if you hadn't taught him self-respect back then, he wouldn't know how to respect another person's decisions today." Those words left me silent for a long time. I suddenly realized that being protected doesn't mean letting someone else step in and act on your behalf. Being protected means someone stands beside you while still allowing you to walk on your own. I didn't return to my son's house. I also didn't hold on to the idea of making them regret anything. I simply kept a new boundary, compassionate but no longer hurting myself in the process. I met my son the next day at a small cafe near the station. I came alone. I wanted this meeting to be just between my mother and me, with no third person speaking on my behalf. He arrived earlier than I expected. When he saw me walk in, he stood up quickly, then sat back down, as if unsure what to do. There was a trace of confusion in his eyes, mixed with fatigue. I realized that my son had aged more than I had noticed the last time I had taken a genuine look at him. We sat across from each other. For a long while, neither of us spoke. I didn't rush. I breathed slowly, feeling my hands resting on the tabletop, reminding myself to stay present. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm managing," I replied. "I just want to talk." I didn't accuse him. I didn't recount every small thing that had hurt me. I only said what mattered most. I told him that when I heard the two of them talk about arranging another place for me to live, I didn't feel angry. I felt that I no longer belonged in that house in the way a mother should belong. I said that what saddened me most wasn't his intention, but the fact that he never asked what I thought, that he made decisions for me, even though I was still clear-minded enough to make decisions about my own life. My son lowered his head. He didn't interrupt. I didn't ask him to apologize. I also didn't ask why he had let things go that far. I understood that some questions asked at that moment would only make everything heavier. "I'm not forcing you to change," I said. "I'm just changing the way I stand in this relationship." He looked up at me. "I won't move back in, not because I'm angry, but because I need space to keep myself at peace. I'm still your mother. But I can't continue living with the feeling that I have to ask permission just to exist." My son was silent for a long time. I could clearly see the struggle in his eyes. Finally, he spoke very softly. "I didn't realize it hurt you this much." I nodded. Some pain doesn't come from bad intentions, it comes from carelessness. I stood up first. Before leaving, I added one more sentence, not to lecture, but to reset a boundary. "When you're ready to listen to me as an adult, not as a burden, I'll still be here." I walked out of the cafe. No victory. No defeat. But for the first time in a long while, I knew I was standing in the right place for myself. I moved to a small town not far from the city. There wasn't much to do there, but there was plenty of quiet. I rented a small house, bright enough, peaceful enough, and private enough for me to clearly hear my own thoughts. In the early days, I lived a very slow pace. I woke up early, made tea, and sat by the window watching people walk their dogs. I didn't rush to fill my time. I let each day pass at its natural pace. It had been a long time since I'd felt that I didn't need to be anywhere on time for anyone or worry about whether I was inconveniencing someone. I began to join a few small community activities. The local library needed someone to read to children on weekends. I signed up. I didn't talk much about my past. I simply sat there, reading slowly, watching small pairs of eyes listen. Each time, I remembered who I had been before I became someone trying to live as neatly as possible in my son's house. I also got to know a few neighbors. They didn't ask who I lived with or why I was alone. They simply greeted me, talked about the weather, and brought over a few homemade pastries. Tiny conversations, but no one made me feel like a burden. The most apparent change was inside me. I no longer woke up wondering whether my son understood me. I no longer spent much time thinking about whether he felt regret yet. I realized that when I kept waiting for others to understand me, I was unknowingly handing over my peace to them. Now I focus only on keeping my heart calm. When I miss my son, I miss him. When I feel sad, I feel sad. But I don't let those emotions pull me back into old cycles. I observe them, then let them pass, like clouds drifting across the sky. I learned to let go a little more, let go of expectations, let go of the need to be recognized. And as I let go, my heart truly felt lighter. Not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer allowed those things to occupy all the space inside me. My son came back a few months later. There was no long notice, just a phone call asking if I was free to have coffee. His voice was different from before, less defensive, less rushed. I agreed, but chose a small cafe near my place, somewhere I felt comfortable. When we met, I could tell he wasn't as fine as he tried to appear. He was thinner, his eyes tired. The certainty of someone who always believed he was doing the right thing was gone. He didn't speak right away. We sat quietly for a while, like two people learning how to be near each other again. "I've thought a lot," he finally said. "I can't say I understand everything, but I know I hurt you." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I also didn't rush to feel relieved. I understood that an honest sentence isn't enough to erase what has happened, but it is a beginning. I told him that I wasn't angry, but I also hadn't forgotten. I said that I needed to see change sustained over time, not just during a difficult phase. I didn't speak with reproach, only as someone reestablishing her boundaries. "We can meet," I said. "We can talk, but I'm not moving back in. And if there ever comes a time when you see me as a burden again, I will stop." My son nodded. No arguing, no justification. I didn't know whether he would keep his word. I didn't need to know right away. I no longer placed my future in someone else's hands. We left the cafe at the same time, but walked in different directions. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel overly relieved either. Just a feeling that was enough. The door wasn't slammed shut, but it was only open to the extent that I could step through safely. When I look back on the road I've traveled, I don't think I've won against anyone. I don't think my son has lost either. There was no contest here to determine right or wrong, only people who had wandered away from each other for a long time and then learned how to stop. I once believed that silence was a way to preserve things, but now I understand that silence only has meaning when it comes from inner steadiness, not from fear of losing a relationship. When I dared to stand with myself, things began to change. Not loudly, not suddenly, but very real. There are things I cannot control. I cannot force my son to grow in the way I hope. I cannot turn back time to fix the months that have passed. But I can choose how I live from here on. Choose not to let sadness lead me. Choose not to let pain define who I am. When I keep my inner calm, nothing throws me into chaos anymore. What comes, I receive. What goes, I send off gently. I no longer carry the question of why everything happened, only the knowledge that I moved through it with kindness toward others and toward myself. If this story resonates with you, perhaps it isn't meant to help you decide who was right or wrong, but to remind you that peace always begins very close, starting with how we treat ourselves, especially in the most challenging moments.